to H D Coulter's YouTube channel. Today I am going to be reading a chapter from Ropewalk, the first book in the Ropewalk series. And in the first chapter you will get to meet Bee, her family, and Captain Hanley. And so sit back, relax, and listen as I read you Ropewalk. Ropewalk, Rebellion, Love, Survival. Book 1 in the Ropewalk series. Written by H D Coulter. Chapter 1. Late March, 1831. Ulverston, a small town crammed onto the side of an estuary, stood shielded by ancient fells, whilst a growing high tide covered the last few remaining pieces of the decaying, disused pier, a time before industrial advancement branded its own mark on the area. Bee sat alone on the old harbour wall, the sun barely visible behind Cartmel Fell, and embraced the silence, the peace of the fresh, crisp morning as the dew soaked into her old evergreen woolen dress. This is where she was at her happiest, waking before the family with only the morning lark serenading her before she became bombarded by the mayhem of home. She watched the restless ships stretch out along the bank, waiting for their turn to enter the canal. The tide was already at its highest, and in an hour it would be gone again. Her dad had taught her the design of most of the ships, what they traded in, whether they were local, where they were going. Now and again a new ship would appear, hailing from a distant land, and she yearned to sail away and to escape from her reality and the foreseen path ahead. She had imagined a life outside her home the moment her father had given her a copy of Gulliver's Travels. In those rare moments of free time, late at night, he had taught her a few words on top of the basic letters she'd gained from school, and the rest she memorized herself in secret. Her mum didn't believe that a girl should read. It gave her airs above her station. But Bee loved books, understanding how and why the changes in the human and natural world manifest themselves, letting herself believe that one day she might use her letters for other purposes. It allowed her to discover what the world was larger than this small town. Over the last few years, the sea air had become thick with tales of travel and adventures, newspapers and books describing recent discoveries by some new explorer. Ulverston even had its own pioneer in the way of Sir John Barrow. Stories flowed through the streets about his most recent travels around the world, passed down through gossip and rumours, stemming both from letters to his family and town chatter. As she gazed at the ships in the distance, Bee saw that they were to dock at Lancaster and Liverpool, not Ulverston. All Ulverston traded in was iron ore, slate, and linen brought down the fells. Nothing exotic about that, she thought. Every day the sailors would go about their jobs, preparing to come into port, fixing down the masts and bringing in the rigging. Their voices would carry across the stillness of the morn, animated at the prospect of spending the 2 days of freedom on shore before they became trapped once again on the open ocean, usually for weeks or months at a time. Ulverston was often full of the ebb and flow of sailors, and of girls of a certain age dressing to impress them, as they paraded up and down Market Street. If Bee's mum had her way, Bee would do the same, exhibiting herself to gain the interest of a potential husband. But Bee didn't want just any man or sailor. She certainly wasn't interested in the examples her mum had indicated as being suitable for her. She wanted to meet someone she could admire and learn from, to be their equal in every sense of the word. The suffocating knowledge that she could do more, be more, drove her towards a forbidden hope that leaving Ulverston with someone worthy and interesting would allow her to truly become herself. And yet, what possibility was there to make a new life halfway across the world? It was just as likely as if she found her fortune buried on the shoreline, she thought ruefully. To pass the time whilst watching the ships being dragged past, she and her dad had on many a mornings taken turns at guessing if it was their own rope strung across each rigging below. The simple game never became old. It was a comfort. A playful, competitive side shone through their banter on both sides. A smile would spread across her dad's face every time he explained his victories, pointing out the colour of the hemp and the even twist. He knew each length of rope he created like she knew every piece of lace she made. It became part of them both, the act of watching something blossom from nothing, the proud, accomplished feeling they enjoyed at the end of their labours. But for her dad, it came from somewhere deeper in his bones and in his blood. Ropewalk was a Lightfoot trademark, a reputation her great-granddad had built up and continued through to her dad, and on to her brothers. As Bea listened to her dad's tales, she found it difficult to picture Ulverston the way he described it years past, a slow, trudging town. To her, after every season that came and went, Ulverston grew bigger and louder thanks to the canal. If it had not come to be, would things be as they were now? Would the pier still have rotted away through lack of use? Would her dad still be a master at his craft? Would she have grown up in the workhouse instead of a family home? And yet Ulverston advanced before its time. Ships able to sail into the town centre doubled the amount of trade and business, bringing with it merchants, mills and gentry, along with the promise of new jobs and more workers than the small collection of buildings could house. One of which is ours, thought Bea, smiling with a touch of irony as she turned to head home. Back across the fields, an array of 4 miscellaneous cottages stood at the end of a muddy track, forming the small hamlet of Outcast. Amongst them was one which had become particularly tired-looking, with its sea-ravaged lime-washed cob walls. The neat edges had been smoothed and polished away. Even the windows had become opaque and milky in the small square lead boxes, as the relentless sea battered, blasted and bleached everything that came within its reach. In the corner, a small wooden cow barn and a neatly ploughed vegetable patch waited patiently for spring to start, whilst hens roamed freely nearby. 10 yards away, a long, narrow building signalled the start of Ropewalk, housing the Lightfoot's rope-making business. With the fires already lit, the smoky smell of coal and wood filled the air, blackening the newly formed clouds above. Bea opened the gate and slowly trudged up the muddy track towards home, bracing herself for the onslaught from her mam. Bea steadily placed her hand onto the iron door handle, and with a deep breath she gave the door a slight push. "Beatrice, is that you? Where have you been? Have you been down to that harbour again?" In one breath, Mrs. Lightfoot bawled, her 3 questions at Beatrice above a harrowing cry from her youngest sister. Sighing, Bea wandered reluctantly back into the suffocating home. "Well, have you? Your father and I have been over this. It's not becoming of a young woman to be alone at such an hour down there. Do you want there to be rumours about you, about your character? How are you ever meant to get yourself a husband if you have a reputation of giving it away for free?" Bea glanced at her mum hopelessly and nodded. She heard this lecture most mornings. Over the years she learned to switch her mind off from the endless biting noise emitted from her more outspoken parent. Through her teenage years the arguments became more frequent and Bea fought back, but that only ignited her mum further, using it as an excuse to seek comfort from Mr. Lightfoot and make life at home unbearable for her daughter, who noticed the enjoyment her mum got from every angry reaction. So Bea, storing up her rage and frustration, instead sought solitude in smaller acts of rebellion. She placed a shawl on the back of one of the chairs and glanced around the room. Her family home had not changed internally in the last 150 years. The thick earthen walls were painted in a light blue lime, reflecting the glow issuing from the large open hearth, and dominated the living space. They positioned the original table her great-granddad had built in the centre of the room, with an assortment of chairs, each one eventually added as and when the previous one broke. Holly, her second youngest sister, was playing silently at the opposite end of the table, whilst Rowan, the youngest, stood in the pulled-out bottom drawer, grasping onto the sides and screaming for attention. Mrs. Lightfoot, perched at the head of the table, leant forward towards her visitor and Mrs. Dent. Mrs. Lightfoot, perched at the head of the table, leant forward towards her visitor and Mrs. Dent, continuing to enjoy her role as overwrought mother. This morning she was using her company voice, a clearer, higher tone, rather than her usual accent. "Do you see, Mrs. Dent, how she doesn't care? Our selfish actions could bring this family into disrepute. Does she listen to me? No." Mrs. Dent lived with her young children in one of the handful of other cottages in the hamlet. A quiet, quirky sort of woman, Mrs. Dent lived with her young children in one of the handful of other cottages in the hamlet. A quiet, quirky sort of woman, she was a harmless creature who 5 years ago had lost her husband in an accident at sea. A large storm had raged over the Furness estuary, resulting in 2 ships crashing against the coast near Barrow. Mrs. Lightfoot had taken her in like a beaten dog, controlling her every move, drowning her in charity to the point where she could not say no. Majority of the time, Mrs. Dent seemed happy, grateful, and unaware of the games being played to gain an unnatural loyalty. Bea, however, saw it all too easily and felt sorry for her mother's companion. Somewhat under duress, Mrs. Dent nodded her head in agreement at Bea and glanced back at Mrs. Lightfoot for approval. "I hope you never experience this treatment from your daughters," her mum finished hotly, her words dripping with reproach. Yes, I do see," Mrs. Dent's meek voice barely audible. Mrs. Lightfoot interjected, "I am her mother, her better." Bea wandered over to the far corner of the room to her sisters, red-faced with tears. Holly stretched out her little chubby arms. "Oh, Roro, there," Bea whispered in her ear as she scooped her up and wiped her hot, sticky cheeks. Automatically, Rowan placed her head into the nook of Bea's neck and clung on tightly with both arms. Bea ran her fingers through Rowan's fiery red curls and peeled off the loose strands glued to her cheeks. "Beatrice, don't you give her any comfort. She's only doing it for attention. She's been like this all morning. You must learn to never seek comfort in that manner. I won't be giving it to you, neither must you. Poor Mrs. Dent and I have not a moment's peace with her wailing. Put her down. I forbid you to mollycoddle her." Bea gritted her teeth and replied sternly, "I'm just taking her to bed." As she made her way to the foot of the staircase, Mrs. Lightfoot bellowed out across the room, "Have you finished the lace off yet? The gentleman who commissioned the piece is collecting it this afternoon. So yes, do take your little sister upstairs and make sure you have it ready." Bea took hold of Holly's little hand and guided her to the door, continuing to balance little Roro on her hip. Without another word to her mum, she silently made her way up to the bedroom, trampling down her fury and frustration with each step. Upstairs, the space comprised of low beams and small windows, perched low just above the oak floorboards. The 2 rooms sat side by side, one for herself and 3 sisters, Beth, Holly and Rowan. The other held a younger brother, Matty, John and Peter. The sun was barely visible over the top of the trees in the distance. A single lead-lined pane of glass was pushed open, allowing a funnel of salty breeze into the room. Staring out through the milky glass, Bea gazed at the fields in front of the cottage, reaching out to the salt marsh as it emerged with the sea, and a scene unchanged for generations. Once Rowan and Holly were safely cocooned in the patchwork blanket on the shared bed, Bea sat on the floor and nestled a padded footstool between her legs. It was covered in a reddish-purple calico, which she had dyed last summer using the rotten berries, so that she could see the ivory threads clearer, making it easier to create a more detailed and intricate lace. Bea was building a modest reputation around the local area for her lace by selling pieces at the dressmakers in town. Her mum had taught her the craft at the age of 6 to help bring in money for the family, but by 10 she could match her own skill and design. By 15 she had overtaken her entirely and taught herself skills and techniques, creating new designs in her own distinctive style. This new piece was one of the best she had created, with its long, detailed panel of roses and leaves, designed for a proud young lady. She examined the lace. She felt the rise and fall of the design, and the pins and the smooth wooden bobbins sitting patiently at the end of the delicate threads. Like an old friend, she knew every intricate detail about her pieces. He held no secrets, giving her advice on where she went wrong and how to remedy the problem. In the end, she was sad to see them leave, as though bidding farewell to a loved one never to be seen again. Bea stretched out her back and pushed her 2 palms together with only the back of her fingers touching, praying for a blessing from the angels of lace. She braided her hair back, weaving her long auburn strands in and out as if it was practice for the threads. The lace was awakening from a deep slumber, and the conversation continued as if no time had passed. Her fingers moved without thought or conscience to the rhythm of the bobbins. She carefully placed a pin in the correct position, and under her hands her roses grew. The last patch of late sunlight highlighted the glowing crown of Rowan's head. She gazed down, watching Bee's fingers weaving in and out while she played with the ginger cat, who also loved to watch the bobbins move, trying slyly on occasion to paw at them herself. To focus her thoughts, Bee sang some of the ballads her dad had taught her. Unable to pronounce the majority of the words, Rowan loved to add her own, clapping and humming along. They repeated the same songs time and time again. As I walked through the meadows to take the fresh air, the flowers were blooming and gay. I heard a fair damsel so sweetly singing, her cheeks like the blossoms of May. Said I, pretty maiden, how came you here in the meadows this morning so soon? The maid she replied, for to gather some May, for the trees they are all in full bloom. Said I, pretty maiden, shall I go with you to the meadows to gather some May? Oh no, sir, she said, I would rather refuse, for I fear you would lead me astray. Then I took this fair maid by the lily-white hand, on the green mossy bank we sat down, and I placed a kiss on her sweet rosy lips, while the small birds were singing around. Rowan, clasping her hands against her mouth, began rolling around on her back and giggling so hard her entire body shook, scaring the cat in the process. Not fully understanding the meaning behind the words the first time they heard it, she and Holly had asked Beth to explain. Beth hastily informed them that it was naughty to kiss boys and not to do it. Now each time Rowan heard the song, she thought it was hilarious. And when we arose from the green mossy banks to the meadows we wandered away, I placed my love on a primrose bank while I picked her a handful of May. Then early next morning I made her my bride, that the world might have nothing to say. The bells did ring and the birds did sing, and I crowned her the sweet Queen of May. Again, again, Rowan pleaded, giggling. No, that's enough today, lovey. Please, Bee. Rowan cast her big brown eyes with full sorrows towards Bee, who tried to distract her by holding up the lace for her to see. Downstairs she could hear the small mantel clock chime out the hour. There, done. Just in time. What do you think? Do you think it will be good enough for the gentleman? Rowan smiled brightly. Downstairs a loud banging noise ricocheted through the cottage, causing the girls to jump and the cat to go flying with a disgruntled meow. Rowan descended into a second fit of giggles. Beatrice, come down at once, her mum called up a couple of minutes later in a sweetly sweet tone, and bring the lace. Bee knew the gentleman buyer must have arrived. Her mum's tone placed her on edge. She had become almost embarrassed for the way her mother flirted with some clientele, and their indifference towards her in return. Coming, she shouted back. Rowan, knowing already in her short years it was best for her to stay out of the way when there were visitors, instead sat playing with the cat, with Holly still sound asleep. Bee delicately picked up the lace and made her way down the stairs. The sooner she got this over with, the sooner she could go outside with the girls, she thought. The gentleman stood leaning against the door frame, silhouetted with the sunlight peering around his coat-tails. Mrs. Lightfoot was standing rather close by, making flirtatious gestures. The gentleman stood leaning against the door frame, silhouetted with the sunlight peering around his coat-tails. Mrs. Lightfoot was standing rather close by, making flirtatious gestures, her best lace cap balancing on top of sagging curls. She turned mid-sentence and faced Bee. Forgive me, ma'am. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just bringing the lace down as you asked. Bee drifted towards the centre of the room, holding out the velvet pouch. On closer approach, she saw the man had a handsome face, with hazel eyes and brown hair. The sunlight warmed his neat side whiskers, transforming them to a golden red. His tall, broad stature filled the door frame, and his weather-worn tan skin and uniform told her he was a sailor, an officer of some sort. He had lost his youthful bloom, and said he was a man in every sense of the word. He stared at Bee with an enormous smile on his face and humour in his eyes. The stare made Bee uncomfortable, awkwardly averting her gaze, her eyes skipping around the room, not knowing where to look. The gentleman chuckled gently at her response. Beatrice, This is Captain Hanley. He's the gentleman who commissioned the lace. Mrs. Lightfoot interrupting, bringing the sailor's attention back to herself. Captain Hanley, this is my eldest daughter, Beatrice, to whom I learnt the craft. Captain Hanley broke through the gap Mrs. Lightfoot had just made and stood in front of Beatrice. Instead of holding out his hand for hers to fall upon, he tilted his head with a slight nod, more customary amongst the working classes. Miss Beatrice Lightfoot, a pleasure to make your acquaintance. His voice was strange, a mongrel of accents stemming from the lakes and Lancashire all the way out to the Caribbean, instantly making him a great deal more interesting than anyone else Bea could think of in the locality. A pleasure to meet you, Captain Hanley. His sight lingered for a moment on her face. Was that you I heard singing outside before? Bea hesitated. She felt attraction building between them. I must admit, I took a moment to stand and listen. Bea felt her cheeks become hot and flushed at his gaze fixed on her face. Yes, sir, that was I. I was singing to my sisters upstairs whilst I finished the lace. He took a couple of steps closer to Bea. He seemed taller now, and standing before her, his scent a distinctive perfume of smoke and spices. He had a presence about him that Bea had never encountered, of arrogance and power. Would you be so good as to show me the lace? Aware of her mum's gaze, she held out her hand in front of her with a small parcel on top. Gently he placed his hand on top of the lace and slid it out from her hand, the tip of his finger caressing the inside of her palm as he slowly pulled away. Bea pulled her hand back towards herself, placing them behind her back, and swallowed hard. The captain, without waiting for an invitation, dragged out a chair and sat at the table. He pulled the lace out of the velvet pouch and explored the ridges of the delicate threads. Very impressive, Miss Beatrice. Truly, it is beautiful. A creative design. It is a match for any I have seen in Manchester, possibly even Boston. Your reputation is not exaggerated. Thank you, sir. She had been remarked upon for her gifts in Ulverston, but never compared to Manchester or lace makers, never mind the Americas. She knew he was a traveller. There you go, Beatrice. Didn't I say she was talented? Manchester, indeed. Taught her everything she knows, Captain Hanley. Mrs. Lightfoot took the compliment for herself, delighted. In one move he pushed back his chair and stood up. I don't doubt that, Mrs. Lightfoot, he muttered, throwing a second glance her way. He delicately placed the pouch into the side pocket and leant forward towards Bea. Thank you, Miss Beatrice. I look forward to watching your gifts continue to blossom with great interest. The end of Chapter 1.